Well, hello, friends. This is Dr. Cindy Lee. Many of you will get to know her because you will all take a class with her when you get to your project stage. But most of you probably don't realize that Dr. Lee is also a trained spiritual director and a professor in our Demon program, and the author of one of the books that is now one of my favorites in our project, Our Unforming De-Westernizing Spiritual Formation. So welcome, Cindy. Nice to have this time with you.
Yeah, it's great to connect with you in this way, Todd.
Thank you. I'm glad. Would you mind just tell me a little bit about you say about some of this stuff in the book, but just from your own point of view, now the book has landed and it's out there. Um, what was the reason why you wrote it? I mean, writing a book is a big labor intensive. What was behind your reason for wanting to write it?
Uh, there are two reasons, one more academic and professional, and one more personal. And so the academic professional reason was just, I kept looking for a resource like this for our classes, particularly our spiritual formation classes. And it just wasn't out there. And, I would have preferred that it would have just been out there instead of writing it myself. But because I kept looking and couldn't find what I really was searching for, eventually it led me to just let me just write it and put it out there for our classes to use. The second reason was more personal in that I had completed a whole PhD program in the area of spirituality, and then I had a life crisis. And that what I was trained to do was to teach a Western-based spirituality and spiritual formation, and it just didn't click on me with me during my education of wait a minute, this doesn't even fit with who I am as an Asian American woman. And it just led me to the question of, did I just waste my whole life and all the money I invested in my tuition and in my education? What have I been doing with my life? And so that led to just a personal search of what is spirituality and spiritual formation in my body and in my social identities. What does that look like? And just needing that permission and that freedom to explore and ask those questions. So that was also an impetus for this book.
Awesome. Oh my gosh. So you use this great phrase, unforming and reforming. Did you
Mhm.
coin the word unforming, by the way?
It
Um,
is a made up word, yes.
yeah, I was
So
thinking
the word processor always highlights that as an incorrect spelling.
it's great. It's one of my favorite things that reminds me that even your writing is disrupting what is the norm for writing, right?
Mhm.
Can you just say briefly about what are some of the unformings that people of faith need in order to lead well? I mean, we're talking to folks who are leading change in churches, nonprofits, organizations. What do you see as some of the unformings that they need, just from your own experience?
Yeah. Well, let me backtrack a little bit just to that word unforming, because, it comes out of, we use the term spiritual formation. And with that term, we're always emphasizing, who are we becoming? So it's always an emphasis on what we're adding into our life, and it has a goal. But spirituality in general, our spiritual life in general, is not just that formation. There are equally seasons where we're needing to let go, seasons where things need to die, right? Things need to um, that we just need to release in our life. That in our spirituality, we have equally those seasons as we do with the formation and the growing and the learning seasons. And so that's why unforming is just as important of a process as forming. So the same is true, maybe even more true for leaders. And I think that's where it connects with the adaptive change process is the unforming and reforming is important for the organizational life as well as the leader's personal life, that we have equally those seasons. So I think collectively as a society, as a culture, we are being asked or invited to release some things as a church, all right, as the Christian church, as the Protestant church. And for some of us, we may be feeling as a tension point, as resistances of what we're being released or invited or asked invited into releasing. But perhaps it's not a resistance or tension. Perhaps these are just invitations
Mm.
of letting go in order that we have space in ourselves and in our communities for something new. So, where we might be feeling these invitations, or perhaps you're feeling them as tensions, one I think is this word of deconstructing,
Hmm.
decolonizing. I think that is a word that we're hearing a lot in for people of faith that are millennials as well as Gen Z in that generation. Um, for them, that is just a feeling of something's not fitting right with the faith that I've been given, with the religion that I've been given. So they are also in a releasing. These are the things that just are not fitting right with me. But I don't think the church is giving them, well, the permission for new imagination.
Yeah.
What is this faith? What is this spirituality like for you? So I think that's one invitation. Another invitation that I'm hearing, particularly with demon students, right, is this tension of people aren't coming back to church post, or through the pandemic, and they're feeling that as a tension point, but perhaps it's an invitation to ask, well, what are they actually wanting and desiring if the structures that we've had before is not what they're wanting or desiring now? Is that an invitation for our structures to be something new? Um, so those are two from a spirituality perspective of where I'm noticing there are invitations to release and let go.
I love the way you use the word invitation is almost a reframe of tension and resistance, right?
Mhm.
Like to actually to lean into this thing you are resisting is actually an invitation into something that you haven't yet experienced yet. It's
Yeah.
just, it really is a beautiful reframe and also kind of a necessary one because we have a tendency to want things that are familiar and that are
Mhm.
right? So let's just dive into, obviously, you're talking about the fact that dominant Western white culture has had a set of spiritual formation practices that just were assumed to be biblical and Christian. And here you are, in one sense, creating some tension by recognizing that doesn't speak to everyone and that letting those voices and experiences kind of reframe and challenge the dominant narrative. What would you say to folks about why this is important for everyone? Like why thinking about this or being aware of this is important for everyone? I mean, certainly it's empowering for people of color. It needs to be that as enough. But I think your book is written that somebody like me, 60-year-old white guy shaped out of that world, finds it incredibly meaningful. So why do you think this is for everyone?
Yeah, I think it's just an awareness, right? That there are other ways of being in this world,
Hmm.
and that an awareness that the trajectory of where church history has gone and come from has set us up that our Christian faith is informed by a Western way of being. And those are just cultural, they're not biblical. But somehow our cultural ways of being have informed our spiritual ways of being, and we just assume that is the norm for everyone. And that includes people of color that we've been taught, well, this is what it means to be a Christian. And we're blind to the fact, oh, this is what it means to be a Western Christian, that we've kind of absorbed
Mhm.
Western cultural values into what we think it means to be a Christian. And so, my book is just to open up our imaginations, because I only have, an Asian way of being that I bring to this book, but that's also just one way of being. But there are many ways of being in this world. And how do those ways of being, reflected in the diversity in this world, actually inform our faith and spirituality, and really just recognizing, well, the way we've been doing it, it doesn't have to be that way. It is not the only way. And so can we open up our imaginations for what our faith and spirituality can be when we are informed by all the different ways of being in this world?
Well, and you use the word, you say that BIPOC communities have expressed their spiritualities in subversive ways that were not recognized. Okay, so you actually even reframe the idea of being subversive as being something that's essential and necessary. Can you say a bit more about how you think these recognizing these subversive ways could be helpful for leaders?
Yeah, well, I think for communities of color, in predominantly white spaces or predominantly white denominations, for example, or organizational structures, they had to figure out a way to be themselves in a system and structure not created for them or with them in mind. And so the subversiveness is creativity, right? How do you express yourself? How do you find your place? How do you be authentically yourself in a box that doesn't allow for you to be that way or to be yourself? And so the subversiveness is actually creativity. And so when you think about it in that way, it's for people of color, often it's been for their survival, in these systems and structures not made for them. But I think we experience all of that in different ways in the organizations that we're with or in. That we subversive means finding creative ways to survive or to thrive, in these structures and systems that are more rigid.
Yeah. And I think there's something that's worth saying. And if I get this wrong, you feel free to push back. This is actually a really important point, and I want to make sure that I'm not just appropriating or distorting. Um, One of the most powerful parts about it is I feel like this is a gift when people who have felt as if the structures and systems have been oppressive stay in the system and work to make it better. I think there's a very loving and caring thing, to be able to say, I am part of this structure and system. I'm not abandoning it. I'm not leaving it. I actually want it to be healed. There's a prophetic act in the middle of that, that I think those of us who are in power just see it as subversive resistance rather than an invitation to creativity. Am I reading that right? Am I overstating that? Or
Well, I don't always encourage people of color to stay in
okay,
organizations
good.
that are
Say more about
harmful to them.
that.
So you're right, it is a gift if they choose to
Right.
stay. That is a nice thing that they're doing.
Yep.
But also, it is usually additional labor,
Mhm.
that they're giving. It can be harmful to their well-being. So personally, that might not be a good choice for them to stay. But yeah, when they do, they are contributing something important to that organization.
Yeah. And that for those of us who are in places of privilege or power to recognize that that is actually that discomfort we might feel at that moment is actually an invitation for us to take that and make the system healthier, more robust, stronger, more inclusive, all those kinds of things that would be more fruitful, right?
Yeah. Well, I would add to that those that have power,
Yeah.
what would it take to give power to to give that power, to those that don't have it? And so I think that's an important, question to add to that.
Yeah. So say more about this notion. I love the way that you reframe these things. You talked about the fact that you went from you made a conscious shift from the word practices to postures. I love
Mhm.
that in your writing. Could you say more about what's behind that and what you're hopeful for that using of that phrase?
Yeah, that just came from an observation of how our modern culture has taken spiritual formation and made it fit with our modern cultural values.
Ah,
And so having practices then fit with our values of productivity and achievement, right? So when they're practices, when we have spiritual practices, they're like actions we do. And often they can just make us feel, oh, I've done my action, I've done my discipline, my practice, check it off the list. I feel good about myself. I feel productive. I can move on, right? It can become something we can schedule into our calendars. So it fits, right, with our modern lives rather than disrupting our modern lives and our values and our productivity. And so shifting it into postures that the practices are just ultimately form our postures. Postures are how we show up in the world. It's how we show up in our community. And it asks of us, am I showing up in a way that is healthy? Am I showing up in a way that is healing for my community, that is empowering for my community? And that is more important than am I just doing my spiritual practices. It's asking, how am I showing up with people?
that's beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of integration here. I mean, I just am picture you sitting in spiritual direction with these directees who come to you who are just open to your questioning. But you interact with most of the students who are going to watch this as this person who helps them get through their project, right? What do you recognize in those moments? Things you might not even say because it's a different role, but what do you recognize as being some of the most commonly ignored postures for these students who are who are leaders? What would you want to hold up back to them to using kind of bringing those two parts of your life together?
Well, I do feel for our students. Most of them are, most of them are in organizations, right? Heavily structured systems, likely through the DMIN program, maybe before the DMIN program, which was the impetus to join a DMIN degree or to get a DMIN degree, was that they're already feeling some dissonance
Mhm.
with the structures that they've been in and known maybe for a long time. And I think it's one important thing from a spiritual director's perspective, right, is the importance of going from the head to the heart.
Oh,
I think our leaders, as well as our demon students, are great in the headspace.
yeah.
They're pastors, they're leaders. They know all the right answers. And then everyone else in the organization, they also think they know all the right answers. When really the tension points we feel in our organizations are not in the headspace, they're in the heart space. And so, what does it mean to be able to engage with people in our communities at the heart level? Where are your reactions coming from? Where are your resistances coming from? And how do we engage with people not at the head level of discussing where are our conflicts, but the heart level? Why are you reacting this way? Where is that coming from? What's important to you from that's coming out as a reaction? And for leaders to be able to engage with people at that heart level.
Mm. Oh,
Um, another thing that's important, I think, is I think we're really desiring and needing contemplative leadership in our times. I think our models of leadership that we've been given is based on productivity. I think contemplative leadership invites us actually into a slowing down, not valuing productivity, but valuing our well-being as leaders and as people of within an organization or community. And so, what does it mean to be a leader that actually invites people into slowing down and rest collectively?
mm. Thank you. Thank you. I want to ask one more question, and if you don't end up feeling comfortable about this, you just let me know, and I'm going to cut this. But I think I'd like to ask you, um, our program is still a pretty dominantly white program. I mean, our students are predominantly white. It's growing. Many of our white males. It's growing in diversity, but it's not there. What do you think that what if you were to help get articulate what, say, people of color or women of color might want the rest of their peers to know that they might not feel comfortable saying, but you could say as a person with a PhD who has a bit more status and security, what would you want them to hear? What could you say that might be helpful?
Uh, Maybe two things. One is racism in the US particularly is actually a white problem, right? It's not a problem with people of color. It's a problem of whiteness or white culture in our society, and the history of racism perpetuated by white people in this nation. And so what that means is ultimately we need white people to talk to other white people, right? So traditionally, the ways that our organizations have handled racism or tried to address diversity and equity and inclusion is to bring in people of color to try to educate white people on what they should do, right? And it ends up being, finding ways for white people to feel better about themselves, less reactive, without actually doing the work. When really, racism starts at a heart, it's a heart issue, not a mind issue. But white people may not feel comfortable talking about those heart issues with a person of color. They would feel more comfortable in addressing the internal issues they need to address within themselves with other white people, which means we need white people who are educated and informed to create the safe spaces for those to do the work they need to do in themselves. And so that's something that I do say with white organizations: step up. Don't expect people of color to do the work for you. We need white people to do that work with other white people. And then the other thing I think for churches in particular is just, I wrote this in the book somewhere, of, traditionally the church has come from, white male leadership. And that has then informed the way, why we do what we do, and the ways how we do what we do, and things like that. If women had been in leadership, if people of color had been in leadership, I'm certain that the way we do church would look really different than today. But it's not too late to find out, right? So to allow women to dream, to allow women of color to dream, to allow people of color to dream. What does this faith look like in our bodies, in our practices, in our gatherings? And then to give them the freedom, the leadership to start exploring that. Because I feel like people are hungry for that as well, but maybe we don't know how to dream. But we have women in leadership, women of color in leadership that do know how to dream, but maybe they don't have the power, the freedom to bring their dreams into realization. And so giving them that freedom to dream and to just disrupt, right? Disrupt the ways we've always done things.
Oh my God. I can feel the invitation in my own tension about your response. That's just so, so helpful. Dr. Lee, thank you. It's a gift for you to be here, and I hope we get to talk more again.
Yeah, and I hope that the class goes well.
Thank you.
All right.